Hello everyone and welcome back to Kobean History. In today's video we will be having a look at all the defenses of a castle. This video is a compilation of all my Anatomy of Castle videos so far, which cover all the external defenses of the castle such as the walls, towers, gatehouse and more. If you prefer to watch all these topics as individual videos, I'll link the playlist in the iCard on screen right now, or it will be linked in the description as well. This video covers everything I cover in that playlist, but I've shuffled some videos and clips around in this video to make it flow a little more smoothly. With that introduction out of the way, I hope you enjoy, and here are all the defensive features of castles. So we will start with talking about how the first castles developed. European castles originated in the 9th and 10th centuries after the fall of the Carolingian Empire, which you might also know as the Empire of Charlemagne. In the grand scheme of things, this empire didn't last very long, and after it fell, its territory was divided among individual lords and princes in various different nations. And this breaking up of the empire might be one of the reasons why castles were developed. It was a way for the monarch or lord to show its dominion over his own region and protect it from the various neighbouring lords, which no doubt aspired to expand their own lands. Another reason that might have contributed to the rise of castles might have been to protect them from the increasing attacks of the Magyars, which were the Hungarians, to the east, the Muslims from the south, and the Vikings from the north. As well as castles being needed for defense, the lord also needed a private residence which was protected, and thus castles also functioned as the home of a lord or a monarch. One of the earliest type of castle that was developed was the Motte and Bailey castle, which had a wooden or sometimes stone keep situated on a raised earthwork called a motte. It was also accompanied by an enclosed courtyard or a bailey, usually surrounded by a protective ditch and palisade. As you might have realized, these early castles did not have proper castle walls like we think of today. Instead, they relied on earthworks and wooden palisades for defense. But in later ages, these defenses would be replaced by the stone defenses that we associate with castles today. The Normans introduced the stone castles to England, and we see a large number of them being constructed after their conquest, such as Chepstow Castle, which is the oldest known stone castle in Britain, built in 1067. But probably one of the most famous Norman castles is the White Tower of London. During the 1300s and 1400s, further developments in castle design led to an increase in the number of wall towers, and many new castles that were built adapted their designs to emphasize on flanking fire, such as the shapes of castles being more polygonal in shape or having concentric defenses, meaning several different stages of defense within each other, which when added up together maximizes the castle's firepower onto an attacking force. During the late Middle Ages, when artillery became powerful enough to break through stone walls, further adaptations were required. And while castles continued to be built well into the 16th century, these new adaptations to deal with cannon fire, such as additions like artillery bastions, made them uncomfortable and undesirable places to live in, and thus true castles were being replaced by artillery forts, and the lords and monarchs moved out of their military defenses to live in more aesthetically pleasing palaces and country houses. Even though these stone walls were not present in earlier castles, their origin dates much further back in time. Uruk in ancient Sumer or Mesopotamia is one of the oldest known cities known to have a stone wall for defense. And even before that, the settlement, which would later become the city of Jericho, had a wall surrounding it as early as 8000 BC. Later on, the Greek and the Romans used stone walls to protect their cities as well, But in the majority of non-Roman Europe during the same time period, we can see that earth and wooden defenses were the norm, like hill forts for example, which would also use their location as a defensive strategy. In Central Europe we also see post-slot walls, which was a common type of wall and did incorporate stone as well, but it can't be called a proper stone wall. As the Roman Empire expanded, their stone wall defenses spread with them. But after the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe, there was a widespread return to the earlier earthen and wooden defenses, which lasted well into the 11th century in some parts of Europe. Some examples of this return to the earthen and wooden defenses after Rome can be seen in the Anglo-Saxon boroughs, which was a protected city, and the Motte and Bailey castles, which we talked about earlier. Defensive stone walls were reintroduced by the Normans. Now we'll have a closer look at the different parts and features of the actual wall. We'll start with the broader terms and then we'll move on to the more specific features of the castle walls. Enceinte is a broad term. It refers to the towers and walls encircling a fortification, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a castle. So it's a collective term for both the towers and the curtain walls surrounding the castle. The towers I'll cover later on in the video. For now I'll focus on the features of the curtain wall. If we have a look at the inside of a wall, we can see on both sides it's a nice masonry finish. But if we look on the inside of the wall, the filling is more of a collection of rougher stones and the mortar to hold it all together. On the outer layer of the wall, it was usually whitewashed to give the castle a nicer appearance, and this was done throughout the castle on all the different buildings. Whitewashing they did using lime, and if you're interested in how that was made, you can watch my video on the quicklime burner. I'll put a link at the end of the video. Now we will go to the top of the wall, to the ramparts. Ramparts are a general term. It doesn't necessarily need to refer to stone walls. So another word to refer to this part where the people would walk on is the wall walk. So this protruding smaller wall that protects the wall walk is referred to as the battlements, or you can also call it the parapet. Or if you're going off of the specific design of it, you can call it Crenelations as well, which we will have a closer look at now. So these are Crenelations and they consist of different parts. You have the merlons which stick out from the top, then the lower parts of the wall are the crenels, and then we also have a name for the empty space in between the merlons, which are called embrasures. And sometimes inside these embrasures, shutters were built. So they had more defense throughout, and they could open them in case they had to shoot arrows and close them if they wanted more defense. In the late 12th century we also see the appearance of arrow loops built inside of the merlons, which allowed them to be covered while they were shooting arrows, instead of hiding behind the merlons while they were getting ready and popping out of the embrasures when they wanted to fire. And now with these arrow loops inside of the merlons, they had cover as well as the ability to fire. Many crenelations we see today are reconstructions, and in later centuries they were also built as an aesthetic feature, not to be functional. Now we'll take a closer look at the arrowslits and their different variations. Arrow loops are also known as arrowslits, loophole, archie, and sometimes balustraria, although balustraria usually refers to it being used by a crossbow. Arrowslits allowed defenders to fire their arrows from cover, and there were many different styles as illustrated here. On the inner side of the arrowslit, the walls are usually cut away in a wedge shape. This allowed the archer to have a good amount of flexibility when shooting at different angles, both vertically and horizontally, whilst any attacking force only had a small target which they had to hit to strike the defenders. Arrowslits were angled in a way so they could provide a cover as close as possible to the foot of the wall, and they achieved angles as small as 5 degrees from a vertical arrowslit in some cases. This is also why towers usually have a large quantity of arrowslits, as they could provide crucial flanking fire to anyone approaching the main wall. Apart from the basic vertical slit, another common shape is a cross. This additional horizontal slit was to give the archer a better field of view so they could scope out the area before using the vertical slit to shoot their arrows through. Immediately behind the slit there was usually a recess called an embrasure. This hollowed out bay inside the thick wall allowed the defenders to get close to the arrow slit without being too cramped. Some arrow slits, such as those at Corfe Castle, had lockers nearby to store spare arrows and bolts as well. These were usually located on the right hand side of the slit for ease of access, and it allowed the archers to have a rapid rate of fire. Although there is some archaeological evidence to support the existence of arrow slits during the Egyptian Middle Kingdom period, the invention of arrow slits is generally attributed to Archimedes during the siege of Syracuse. These were described as being of the height of a man and about the palm's width on the outside, which allowed defenders to fire bows and scorpions from within the walls. And afterwards, arrow slits became common in the late Greek and Roman defenses. Evidence of arrow slits became scarce after the fall of Rome, and arrow slits in medieval defenses were rare before the year 1190. They seem to have been only reintroduced towards the end of the 12th century in castles such as Dover and Farmlingham in England and Richard Lionheart's Chateau Gaillard in Normandy. In these early medieval examples, arrow slits were positioned to protect specific sections of the castle, rather than protecting the whole perimeter of the castle. They were normally just simple vertical slots, but features like the inner wedge shape and the horizontal viewing slit developed soon after. In the 13th century, it became common for arrow slits to be placed all around the castle's defenses, and in some cases the ends of the slits became rounded as well, and these were known as ulliets. In its simplest form, arrow slits were a thin vertical opening. However, the different types of weapons used by defenders sometimes dictated different designs. Openings for longbowmen were usually tall and high to allow the user to fire standing up, but those for crossbowmen were usually lowered down, as it was easier for crossbow users to fire whilst kneeling to support the weight of the weapon. Usually the horizontal slits were placed in the middle of the vertical slit, which created a cross shape, but less common was to have the slits offset, such as in White Castle in Wales. This design provided attackers with a smaller target. However, it has also been suggested that this was done to allow the defenders of White Castle to keep the attackers in sight for longer because of the steep moat surrounding this castle. It's also possible for an arrow slit to be connected to multiple embrasures, or the other way around, an embrasure can also be linked to multiple arrow slits. A great example of this is Carnarvon Castle, and if I remember correctly, there was a siege there once where there weren't that many defenders defending the castle from a larger outside force. And because the arrow slits and embrasures were linked in this way, it seemed to the outside that there were a lot more archers inside the castle firing out at the enemy. When firearms and cannons became common in the late medieval and Renaissance periods, fortifications had to adapt their arrow slits to accommodate these. These types of holes are known as loopholes or cannoniers, which were used to fire guns or cannons through. To prevent detection, the rifle's muzzle should not protrude through the loophole, however, particularly at night, as the rifle should be fired within the wall to hide the muzzle flash. So next up we have hoardings. Hoardings were a wooden structure that was added on top of the wall for extra defense. And it was built to lean over the wall so they had more angles of fire, and also a way to fire on enemies below them at the foot of the wall if the attackers made it that far. There were quite a few different types of hoardings and also different ways of attaching them to the top of the wall. They could just be placed on the very top of the wall or even a little higher at the height of the parapet so people could lean over them to shoot down or forwards. Or if there were arrow loops in the merlons, those holes could be used to support the beams as well to build the structure. But we also see that some castles had built-in slots inside of the wall, built specifically to support wooden beams of hoardings. This is the type you see pictures of on screen right now. So in this case they would have to go through the embrasures in between the merlons to get to the hoardings. There were also more ways to build hoardings, but we won't go into that in this video. Now there is a possible misconception about hoardings, that because of the fact that they were made out of wood, they were only temporary. But this is just an assumption, probably because we don't really see hoardings on medieval castles anymore today, because the wood has already long rotten away. But yeah, it's more likely that hoardings were built and then left there in case the need arises, instead of building and taking them down again every time an attacking force is nearby, because some hoardings could last for years or even decades, still being structurally sound. Later on, a stone feature developed, taking the same use as hoardings. These features are called Machicolations, and like hoardings, their aim was to be able to fire upon enemies below them at the base of the wall. Machicolations were used in a variety of forms as well. You had the standard ones just at the bottom of the parapet on top of the wall. You also had them built into more protective walls, which were covered at the top. Or they could even be implemented in a lower section of the wall and not at the very top. Now these protrusions that would support the parapet above are called corbels. Corbels were used throughout history, so they're not exclusive to castles or castle walls. These were common types of machicolations, but there are also some more unusual varieties, like the sur-arch machicolations. They weren't very common, but one example of them can be found at Chateau Gaillard. Now as you can see, these machicolations were quite long, and instead of protruding out of the wall on the top, they are more similar to indents. Now there is a disadvantage to these, because you'd have a blind spot in between the bases of the arches in between the machicolations. But these unusual machicolations did incorporate a feature that we will talk about next, which is this slanted area over here. In the common castle, these would be at the base of the wall, and they're called batters or taluses or plinths. They have multiple names. But what it comes down to is that at the base of the wall is a bit wider and it has this little slant at the bottom. These plinths had a variety of uses, but we will start with the use incorporating the machicolations above. Because the first use is when you drop down items from the machicolations above, it would hit these slanted parts, and the rock or whatever they threw down would bounce off of it in a forward direction towards the enemy, giving these projectiles a greater range. Another use of it was to strengthen the wall itself. Because it was wider at the base, the weight of the wall would be distributed more, and this helped to counteract the practice of undermining, where the enemy force would dig a tunnel underneath the wall and then try to collapse it that way by making it unstable. Also, with other siege tactics, it would make it more difficult, because most conventional siege weapons were built to lean up against the wall, like siege towers or ladders. Now to come back to Machicolations, we also had a similar structure called the Brattice. Unlike Machicolations, which would usually run the length of the wall or surround the whole tower, a Brattice was a localized defense, using the same strategy as Machicolations to throw projectiles or shoot down from a hole aimed below them. And Brattices were built inside of the walls. A Brattice also looked quite similar to another feature you'd find inside of a castle, which would shoot out another kind of projectile. That would be the guard rope or privy, which was a latrine. Now luckily there is a way to tell the difference. A guard rope would usually be in the inner parts of a castle where the residence was, not on the outer defensive wall. Also, a Brattice would usually be constructed above a window or a doorway. because that's where it would be most useful to defend the weak points where the enemy would try to get into the castle. And for obvious reasons, the guard rope would tend to not be above a window or a doorway. Now that was enough talk about latrines, so we'll get back to the castle wall. So as mentioned earlier, the Brattice would be built inside of a wall, but a similar structure could be constructed at the top of the wall, and this would be called a Bartizan. Now on this picture you can see some Bartizans, and below them you see kind of supports built inside of the wall. These supports are called Buttresses, and they don't necessarily need to be there for the Bartizans to be there, but could also be generally constructed on the face of a wall to strengthen it as well. You also had bastions. Nowadays when we hear bastions we usually think of the artillery bastions, but these later artillery bastions had their origin in the bastions of medieval castles, which would have looked something like this. Now the last feature of a castle wall that I want to talk about is a feature that I don't hear mentioned that much. And before I researched this video I didn't even know that was a specific feature of a castle. Some castles would have a shield wall, which was a higher portion of wall, a lot higher than the surrounding walls, and this could be built to protect a building on the other side of it, or to have one part of the wall where it was extra fortified. There was no universal tower design, and the shape and look of the tower depended on the terrain, the designer's vision, and the available resources and finances, which gave us a large variety of tower designs in Europe. In the early medieval castles they were usually wooden towers, and they were attached to the wooden stockades, which would have encircled the main keep or bailey. But sadly, due to the rotting nature of wood, we are unsure how abundant and prevalent these kinds of towers were. Later on in the Middle Ages, more stone was being used inside of the defenses, and this is also when we see stone being used inside of the towers. These could either be fully out of stone, or it could also be a tower with a stone base, but then the top would have been made out of wood or daub and wattle. The towers could be an integral part of the wall, or they could be separate entities attached to the wall but not accessible through the walls. Wall towers usually also had multiple floors, but they weren't always connected internally. For example, you might have to go outside again and there would be an external staircase, or you might have to go to a different part of the wall to access the upper floors of the tower. On the other hand, in some cases the towers were only accessible via the wall walks, and in some castles they even had their own small drawbridges, making the tower a small fortress. Towers were also sometimes left open at the back, and there were multiple reasons why this was done. Not only does it take less materials to construct, making it cheaper and faster to construct, but because of the open back it was also easier to haul up supplies to the different floors of the tower. And this open back also protected the defenders from the enemy. In case the enemy takes that tower, they can't use it against the defenders, which would still be on the inside of the castle. Most of the early castles had square-shaped towers. These were easier to construct but had downsides as well, as they had dead angles and were more vulnerable to undermining. So during the 12th century, most medieval castles started to construct circular or semicircular towers. This was also around the same time when the plinths were being incorporated into the medieval European castles. The Europeans had seen these circular designs as well as the plinths during the Crusades in the Near East, and they adopted the superior design when they returned home. It has to be mentioned, however, that this was not a new invention, as the Romans had already known circular towers were more efficient than square ones. For example, the city walls of Carcassonne already included the D-shaped towers of Roman design. This also doesn't mean that rectangular towers were all replaced by round towers. as rectangular towers still had some advantages. They were easier to construct and they also gave a good amount of usable internal space. Rectangular towers continued to be constructed even though they knew the advantages of the round towers as well. The advantages of the round towers were that because of the round shape you didn't have as many dead angles while defending, and the round shape was also more stable, making it more resistant to siege technology. There's also a subdivision of round towers called drum towers. These are usually shorter in height and have a wider diameter, resembling a drum. A good example of this, although it's not a wall tower, is the tower at Windsor Castle. The advantages of rectangular towers and the advantages of round towers could also be incorporated into one tower. Then you'd get a D-shaped tower or a horseshoe-shaped tower. This comprises of a round tower at the front facing the attacker and a square tower at the back facing the inside of the castle. So this way they had the defensive capabilities of a round tower, but they would also get more internal space from the square tower at the back, as well as getting a larger fighting platform at the top of the tower. Polygonal towers were a thing as well. A common form of these was an octagonal tower. Polygonal towers were not as defensive as round towers, but they were more defensive compared to rectangular towers, and still giving a reasonable amount of internal usable space. Towers could also be projected out of the wall to give the defenders a better flanking angle for when the attackers are really close or trying to breach the wall. Towers like these are also commonly known as flanking towers. The spacing of the towers along the wall could vary as well. The most obvious place for a wall tower would of course be at the corners. But with bigger castles, more towers were added along the perimeter of the wall as well, and this could either be done in regular or irregular intervals. In the Crusader states, the Europeans found that placing mural towers in regular intervals gave a bigger defensive advantage, so by the 13th century, many of the newly constructed castles in Europe adopted this design as well. Now I'll talk about moats, what their uses are and how they developed. There are different types of moats, but we will go over that later in the video. But in general, a moat is a deep and broad ditch, either dry or filled up with water. It's a feature dug out by humans, generally surrounding a castle. You can also have some moats inside of it, but we will go over that later. So a moat could be used for a castle, but also for any other fortified structure or a town. It usually provides the first line of defense, and during the Middle Ages you'd rarely see a castle without some kind of moat, whether it was a dry moat or one filled with water. That was unless the location where the castle was built already formed a good enough defense. A moat made access to the walls difficult for siege weapons, such as siege towers or battering rams, which would have needed to be brought up against the wall to be effective. And other siege tactics, such as the practice of undermining, so that means digging tunnels under the castle walls in order to cause them to collapse, was made very difficult as well when there was a moat, especially if it was filled with water. Now I will go over how the moat as a feature developed. In older fortifications such as hill forts, which developed during the late Bronze and Iron Ages, simple ditches were built around it as a defense to slow down the momentum of an attacking force. And these ditches aren't too far off from later moats. The word moat derives from the Old French motte, meaning mound, and originally referred to a central mound on which a castle was built. We can see this in early motte and bailey castles, where the motte part of it refers to this part of the fortification. So it was rather a mound instead of a ditch that was dug. But it later came to refer to an excavated ring around a fortification, what we would now call a dry moat. But if a source of water was nearby, it could be diverted to fill up the moat, adding an extra defense to it. Now I will go over the difference in moats. There are a few different types. We will start with the basic dry moat. It's similar to those ditches of hill forts that we talked about earlier, but dry moats would have been wider and deeper. They had to be deep enough so that attacking forces couldn't easily cross them, and wide enough so they couldn't just jump over it or build a small basic bridge over them. Sometimes with dry moats, spikes could also have been put at the bottom of them, forming an extra defense as well. We also have neck ditches. Earlier I mentioned that castles in a strong natural position might have not needed moats, but even these castles could have had some kind of moat, but only on the side without any natural defenses. Here a dry moat would have been dug across the narrow part that connects the peninsula on which the castle was built. This type of dry moats are called neck ditches. This was a common feature of hill castles and spur castles, and this created a bottleneck where the only viable way into the castle would have been over the bridge or drawbridge that crossed over the neck ditch. Moats could also be built within a castle or town to separate different elements within it, such as separating an inner and an outer ward. These types of moats are referred to as cross ditches. During the Middle Ages, there were more castles without a water-filled moat than you might have expected. This was because it was hard to fill up the moat with water if there wasn't any river or lake in the close vicinity. Of course, if there was one nearby, they would have diverted it into the moat, but in Western Europe, water-filled moats only became more popular in the late Middle Ages. In Eastern Europe, however, it was another story, because they would have an abundance of natural water sources spread throughout the land, and in some places, due to the high groundwater table, moats could have even filled up themselves after being dug out. Wet moats surrounding a castle are now seen as romantic, but this view is a later invention when castles became more used for aesthetics rather than defense. In fact, the castles that did have water-filled moats during the Middle Ages were not that pleasant, as these moats were generally used as a dump for food waste and human waste, making it more like a cesspool, which commonly is not seen as very romantic. In some places, wet moats evolved into more extensive water defenses, such as natural or artificial lakes surrounding a castle, or dams and sluices being built. As any opening in a fortification's wall, gateways are weak points inside of castles, and thus to maximize the defensibility of the castle, the majority of castles would have had only one entrance gate, excluding any postern gates. Larger castles might have been separated into different sections, and it is possible that every section had its own gatehouse, forcing the enemy through a series of gatehouses before being able to reach the keep. I've also seen it mentioned that some castles did not have any gate at all, and everything was supposedly hoisted over the walls to get things in and out of the castle. Although I've not found a real-world example of this, so I can't say with 100% certainty that they actually did exist. If such a castle did exist, it was probably a smaller castle. If any of you know of an example of a castle without a gate, where everything was just hoisted over the walls, let me know in the comments below. As well as castles, defended towns ideally only had one gate as well. But for larger towns this wasn't always possible with the huge amount of traffic that would have to come through. So larger towns would have had multiple gates, but still towns rarely exceeded more than 4 gates. In early fortifications, the structural concept, which would later become the gatehouse, started off as just some additional battlements around the gate. But since the gate is the easiest point of entry into any fortification, a lot of additional obstacles were implemented around it throughout the ages, forming the castle gatehouse we know today. The gatehouse was the most important structure to defend in the castle after the keep, and we see this in the period when wooden castles started to be converted into stone. The first places where stone was implemented were in the keep and the gatehouse. And when wall towers started to be built, the first place where we can find them is around gates as well. The approach to the gatehouse could also be placed at an angle, as to not face directly outwards to make it harder to be hit by siege equipment. Or the path leading up to the gatehouse could also swerve or bend, so those bringing up a battering ram will have a harder time doing so and take longer. Later on, Barbicans could be placed in front of the gatehouse as well, which is an additional line of defense, which I will cover in more detail near the end of the video. The gatehouse was also a good place to position flanking towers. These towers gave a good line of sight onto the drawbridge or the approach of the gate. So this enabled archers to be able to fire on the enemy from multiple angles as they were approaching the gate. Later on, the two flanking towers could have been connected to each other, forming an overhang over the area just outside of the entrance. A drawbridge is part of the gatehouse and can be raised or lowered to give access to the fortification by bridging a moat or a ditch. Although there are exceptions to this, for example this drawbridge in Dover Castle doesn't have a moat or ditch. Instead it has a pit which is revealed once the drawbridge is lifted. It's not always the whole bridge leading to the entrance that is lifted, however. It could also be that just the part closest to the entrance would be able to move and the rest of the bridge would be solid. Early castles might not have had drawbridges yet. Instead there could be just a solid bridge leading up to the gate, but this bridge would have been designed to be easily destroyed or removed in the event of an imminent attack. But in later ages drawbridges became common. The easiest design of a drawbridge is one that would be raised or lowered using ropes or chains attached to a windlass or winch. The location of the winch can vary. Usually it's located in the room above the gate passage, but it could also be below it or even inside of the passage, as you can see from this example on screen, where the big wheel to the left side is used to raise and lower the drawbridge. But this system would only be able to be used on a relatively light drawbridge. For heavier bridges, a counterweight system would have to be put in place to give enough leverage to shift the bridge's weight. So we will have a look at these more complicated drawbridge designs. There are multiple ways to implement counterweights. The chains or rope of the drawbridge could be connected to weights which were dropped down a hole. The hole would be a specific depth, so that when the counterweights reached the bottom, the bridge would have lifted up by 90 degrees. If the hole was too shallow, the drawbridge wouldn't have closed all the way. Or if it was too deep, the drawbridge would slam into the gatehouse with a lot of momentum, possibly causing damage to both structures. So getting this depth right was crucial. This was a quick way to raise the bridge, but would take a little longer to lower again, as the counterweights would have to be pulled up. But overall it was easier to operate and required less manpower. The counterweight might also be incorporated into another defensive feature, such as using a portcullis as the counterweight. So when it was dropped, the drawbridge would go up as well, activating two lines of defense at the same time. Sometimes a drawbridge didn't even have any visible ropes or chains. In this example, you can see that the moving part of the bridge extends into the gate passage. The part of the drawbridge on the inside has a counterweight on it and is held in place by a beam. When the beam is removed, the platform will swing down into the pit below and thus raising the bridge on the outside as well. It's also possible to have a winch in the system to aid in moving the platform. By the 14th century, lifting arms, called gaffs, became popular. These are beams above and parallel to the bridge, the ends of which were linked by chains to the far end of the bridge, and the beams would also extend within the gatehouse and were used as a lever to raise the bridge, with the gatehouse wall acting as the pivot point. When in the raised position, the gaffs would fit into slots made in the gatehouse wall, known as rainiers. Inside the gatehouse, counterweights could have been attached to the beams, or the beams might have formed a supporting structure to go over and around the wooden gate inside, making the wooden gate harder to breach when the bridge was raised. These beams might have also fitted in slots inside of the floor where they could be secured. I also found these depictions of rolling bridges, which I found quite interesting, so I wanted to share them here, but I'm not sure how prominent these actually were. Now we'll go into more detail about the specific aspects of gatehouses, starting with the gate door itself, which were usually made out of wood, because doors still had to be light enough to be physically moved. To maximize its strength, they were made as thick as possible while still being practical. Often the layers of wood which the door was made of alternated between being laid out vertically and horizontally, as to have the grain of the wood being spread out in multiple directions, making it more difficult to break through it. On the side of the door facing the interior of the castle, they would have also had a slot to put in a big block of wood, to make it more sturdy and prevent the enemy from opening the gates. In addition to wood, some doors were also reinforced by metal plates, but there was a limit as to how much metal could be used in a door, as too much metal would have made the door too heavy to move. Putting spikes on the gate door is something you might have heard of as well. This wasn't done much in Europe, but was primarily done in India to deter barging by elephants. Incorporated within a bigger gate, you might have sometimes seen a smaller doorway. These are known as wicket gates or wickets, and they are typically small, narrow doors located either next to or incorporated within the larger gate, which could be the gate to a castle or a city gate. These gates were designed so only one person at a time could pass through them. They could also be quickly opened and closed to let someone in or out, in contrast to the main gate, which was heavier and took more time and effort to open, which could put the castle at risk. Due to the fact that only one person could fit through the wicket gate at a time, it was also easier for guards to control and inspect those who passed through the gate. In walled cities, these narrow doors could also allow late arrivals to gain entry into the city after the main gates had closed at night. If the wicket is set inside of the main gate and there's a bit of a high threshold to come through, meaning you'll have to lift your legs a bit, it could also be referred to as a manway. And if the wicket is not set inside of the main gate, but instead is a separate entrance next to or nearby the main gate, it can be referred to as a pedestrian entrance. This type of double entrance was not very common, and it was only really worth having if the gateway had a lot of traffic coming through it. The separate pedestrian gate could even have its own drawbridge, and sometimes even led you through a separate gate passage to get into the castle. Wickets tended to be easily visible, and no effort was made to hide them, so these wicket gates should not be confused with the hidden sallyports or postern gates which a castle might have as well. These kinds of gates I will cover later on in the video. A portcullis is a latticed grille or gate made of wood, metal, or most commonly a combination of both. Note that fully metal portcullises would be quite heavy, so only smaller portcullises could be made fully out of metal. The word portcullis comes from French and it means running or sliding gate, because unlike regular gates, These were lowered or dropped from above using chains or ropes attached to a winch system, usually located in the guard room above. The portcullis was also set in grooves inside of the walls of the gatehouse. It was also common to add spikes to the bottom of it, which, apart from being lethal when dropped on someone, could also fit into holes made in the floor. This enabled the portcullis to slot in place and increase its sturdiness, making it harder for attackers to dislodge it, even though it shouldn't take too much to lift it up. A few people working together could hold it up, while others could slip beneath it. The most common type of portcullis is the latticed grille, which you probably think of when you hear portcullis. But it's also worth mentioning that portcullises had a solid variety as well. There would often be 2 or more portcullises in the gatehouse. When the castle was under attack, these could be left open to lure the enemy troops into the Gatehouse Passageway. Then when they were inside of the passage, these 2 portcullises could be dropped in quick succession, giving the enemy no time to escape, and they'd now be trapped in a killing area with nowhere to run. The walls inside the passage could have been lined with arrowslits, and murder holes could have been fitted into the ceiling above. Another term for these features is meurtriers, and these enabled archers or crossbowmen to eliminate the trapped attackers with arrows from nearly every angle. As well as shooting arrows through them, murder holes could also be used to drop things onto the enemy below. Most will think of hot oil being dropped down them, but this wasn't often done, as cheaper materials did the trick as well. Rocks could be thrown from them, and boiling water or scalding hot sand could also be poured on the enemy crowd below. Throwing rocks from them or boiling water was pretty common, but other things could be used as well, depending on what was available inside of the castle at the time. Sometimes the attackers might try to light fires in the gatehouse to try and burn down the wooden doors. Murder holes could also be used to put out these fires by pouring water on them from above. Speaking of fires, the chapel was also sometimes built inside of the gatehouse. In this case, if the enemy tried to burn down or destroy the main entrance to the castle, they could possibly also destroy or damage the chapel, which could incur the wrath of God upon the attackers. And in the mind of the defenders, having built the chapel inside of the gatehouse might have given it some divine protection, as God would not want his chapel destroyed. The Gatehouse Passage sometimes also featured trapdoors built in the floor. These would be locked in time of peace as to allow traffic to still pass through the gatehouse, but during an attack these would be unlocked. When the enemy walked over it, they'd fall through and either be trapped or killed in a chamber below. But from what I could find, these trapdoors were not that common. The concept for some of the gatehouse features I've talked about in this video date all the way back to antiquity. But it took a while for all these features to become fully integrated into the gatehouse structure. The gatehouses in early castles were fairly basic. Gatehouses with all or most of the features I mentioned generally start appearing near the end of the High Middle Ages, and continued to develop in the Late Middle Ages. The building itself became correspondingly larger and grander as well, and it was common for them to be 2 or 3 stories high, but they also could be made even higher. As well as being defensive, gatehouses were also designed to impress other lords and rulers, and anyone else who visited the castle for that matter. This is why even today many gatehouses are still one of the most impressive parts of a castle. As a result of the exterior of the gatehouse becoming so extravagant, castle gatehouses also began to contain some of the grandest rooms in the entire castle. The lower floors of the gatehouse would often be where the gatehouse keeper lived and the guard rooms were located. but the higher floors could contain some extravagant chambers and accommodations, which were usually reserved to house important visitors to the castle. I mentioned in the beginning of the video that the most important parts of a castle are the keep and the gatehouse. These two structures were sometimes combined into one structure, with the residential quarters located in the gatehouse. This kind of building can be referred to as a gatekeep, and a good example of this is Harlech Castle in Wales. The two biggest outer towers contain bedchambers flanked by a chapel and a vestry. The gatekeep also included two vast chambers which were general rooms for everyday life in the castle. Below were the rooms you'd find in a regular gatehouse. Harlech also had flanking towers, and to get into the castle you'd also have to pass 3 heavy doors and 3 portcullises, which was not uncommon for a castle of this size. The King's Gate in Carnarvon Castle, also in Wales, would have been on a whole nother level had it been completed as planned. It would have probably ranked as one of the most fearsome castle gatehouses in the UK, but what we see today is only a part of the planned gatehouse, so it is not as impressive as it could have been. If it had been fully completed, attackers would have to have overcome the first drawbridge protected by 2 connected polygonal towers. Then they'd have to get through 5 doors and as many as 6 portcullises set in the Gatehouse Passage, which was full of arrow loops and murder holes. Then the passage takes a sharp right turn into an even narrower passage, leading through to the second drawbridge, which would have connected the gatehouse to the lower ward of the castle. On the first floor, above the main gate passage, there was also a room which most probably was a chapel. At the end of the Middle Ages and afterwards, with the development of cannons and artillery, castles weren't as useful anymore in warfare, and wealthy castle owners began to modernize or build castles for show and prestige. As a result, gatehouses became even larger and grander. As an example, we go yet again to Wales. So we're looking at the gatehouse of Raglan Castle, which was built to impress guests as they rode up to the castle's entrance. But as impressive as it might look, as far as defense goes, there is not much there to hold back an attack. So we'll be having a look at the Postern Gate, which is also sometimes known as a sallyport. This is a small door or gate separate from the main entrance in a city or castle wall. They were generally only big enough for one knight and horse to pass through at a time, and were often located in a concealed location beyond the reach of enemy siege equipment, allowing the occupants of the city or castle to come and go relatively unnoticed in the event of a siege. It served as an exit through which defenders could escape, riders with messages could be dispatched from, or small raids on the besieging army could be launched from. The term postern basically means back door. It can also mean a tunnel or passage. And the term sallyport comes from the military raids which could be launched from them. The word sally comes from the French term salle. This is also a synonym to the term sortie, which is a military maneuver that can be carried out during a siege. This is when a smaller defending force attacks or harasses an isolated or vulnerable group of enemies, after which they quickly retreat back to their defenses before the enemy can arrange an effective counterattack. Sallies are a common way for besieged forces to reduce the strength and organization of the besieging army. Targets for these raids include tools which defenders could capture or destroy, or they could also sabotage or disrupt the construction of the attacker's siege works, such as trenches, mines, siege engines, and siege towers. Sometimes the defenders also stole or destroyed the enemy's food supply. so therefore the term sallyport is used to refer to this gateway that allows the troops to make these sallies without compromising the defensive strength of their fortification. A Barbican is a defensive structure that could be added as an additional defense before reaching the gatehouse, and the word Barbican means protected outpost. Barbicans did not have a standard design, and the term can refer to any additional defense placed in front of the main gatehouse. Some Barbicans were connected to the gatehouse, being linked to it by walls which forced the enemy through a narrow passage. This is the most common type of Barbican and could vary in length, such as this short one projecting out from the gatehouse, or this long one, which creates a passage by following the length of the inner wall. In other cases, they were only linked to the gatehouse by a drawbridge, basically acting as a standalone gatehouse, which the attackers would have to overcome before even being able to reach the main gatehouse. This concept could also be duplicated multiple times, creating a passage comprising of a series of gatehouses. But Barbicans didn't necessarily have to be located just in front of the gatehouse, they could have also been set a distance away from the main gate, allowing the castle to extend its defensive area further away from its walls. Another type of Barbican formed a defensive courtyard that would be connected to the gatehouse with a drawbridge. This courtyard was generally square or semicircular in shape and would have had its own walls with a gatehouse as well. Some Barbicans would take it even further and would have fully walled this courtyard, usually in a circular shape, creating a killing area where any attackers would be surrounded on all sides. A good example of this is the Krakow Barbican. Now I just want to take a specific look at the medieval city of Carcassonne in southern France, as well as the castle of Caerphilly in Wales. Carcassonne has multiple entrances into the city, and pretty much every one of them has a different type of Barbican. This is a depiction of the Wicket Gate. Here you can see they had a circular Barbican connected to a long-walled passage to get into the city. At the top of this picture you can also see the Barbican of the Seat of Carcassonne, which was a fortification within the fortification of the city. This was a semicircular courtyard connected to the Seat with a bridge. This one is incorporated within the outer wall of the city, as the city had two walls. And here the bridge which you had to cross to enter the wall is covered by these stone defenses, as well as having a semicircular courtyard to the side of it. There's also a fourth Barbican which protects the Postern Gate of the city walls. I also wanted to show Caerphilly Castle, which as you can see has a lot of Barbicans. This is the main center of the castle, which has a second wall around it with two Barbicans. These lead to their own baileys or courtyards, which have their own Barbicans. And in the case of this one, even this Barbican has its own Barbicans. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed. The Anatomy of Castles playlist will be on screen right now, or you can check out my channel to find more historical topics. I'd like to thank my patrons for their support, especially my $25 patrons G. David and Parker Dye.